Detroit, 1961. The winter wind outside Motown's Studio A rattled the thin windows, but inside the cramped recording room, the air buzzed with warmth and electric possibility. The wooden floors creaked beneath the footsteps of musicians setting up cables, tuning instruments, and adjusting microphones older than some of the engineers using them. Smokey Robinson had just finished a session an hour earlier. The air still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and coffee, but now the room was waiting for a kid so small he barely cleared the height of the mic stand. 11-year-old Stevland Judkins, not yet known to the world as Stevie Wonder, stood in oversized shoes and a hand-me-down coat, his fingers tapping nervously against his thighs. He was blind, tiny, and full of more sound than he could possibly hold. And tonight would be his first real studio session, the night he stepped into the legendary room that had already birthed hits echoing across Detroit. But no one, not even the seasoned studio engineer, was prepared for the moment that was about to unfold. Across the control room glass, engineer Hal Dixon rubbed his temples, exhausted from a long day of back-to-back takes. Hal had worked at Motown for years, watched teenage hopefuls come and go with fire in their voices and fear in their eyes. But when Berry Gordy introduced him to the little blind boy with a harmonica hanging from a string around his neck, Hal nearly chuckled. "He's tiny," Hal muttered under his breath. "Tiny." But when the kid smiled, it was like the whole room brightened. Stevie wasn't intimidated by the towering microphones or the maze of cables snaking across the floor. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, to the light vibration of the drum skins, to the deep thump of the upright bass. He didn't need sight to understand the room. He could feel it. Hal watched, unsure whether this was going to be a disaster or a miracle, unaware that the next minutes would rewrite everything he believed about talent. Musicians stepped aside as Stevie approached the main microphone, a tall, gleaming RCA ribbon mic that required careful handling and precise distance. Even professionals needed coaching to use it without blowing out the levels. Hal leaned forward, ready to guide him. But Stevie lifted a hand gently, as if sensing exactly where the mic stood. He touched the bass lightly, slid his fingers upward until they met the cool metal grill, and smiled. Then, without being told, he adjusted his stance, stepping half an inch back, tilting his chin at the perfect angle, aligning himself the way only seasoned singers knew how. Hal blinked hard. "No way," he whispered, leaning even closer to the glass. He hadn't said a single instruction. No one had. Yet the tiny blind boy stood with the confidence and precision of a trained studio veteran, and before a single note was recorded, Hal Dixon already felt something strange flicker inside him, something that felt like awe. Hal Dixon slid his chair closer to the console, his fingers hovering above the faders as if preparing for a delicate surgery. He expected to guide the boy, expected to stop the take within seconds to give instruction, expected to recalibrate levels after the kid inevitably leaned too close or belted too loud. That's what beginners did. That's what even grown adults did their first time under a studio ribbon mic. But Stevie stood there, still tapping lightly on his thighs, breathing steadily, as if he already knew how fragile the equipment was, as if he already understood the invisible rules seasoned singers spent years learning. "All right, little man," Hal said through the talkback button, forcing a lightness he didn't feel. "When you're ready, give me a little sound. Just a test hum." Stevie lifted his chin, eyes unfocused behind his thick glasses, and nodded. But instead of humming immediately, he took a moment, tilting his head left then right, feeling the subtle resonance of the room in his bones. Hal's eyebrows rose. The kid wasn't guessing. He was calibrating. When Stevie finally opened his mouth, the room transformed. A soft hum slipped out first, smooth, warm, perfectly controlled, hitting the microphone with just enough distance to avoid distortion. Hal's jaw slackened. That wasn't a random hum. It was a pitch, clean, centered, floating, like a thread pulled from pure silk. Stevie paused after the first tone, waiting. Hal scrambled, checking the meters. They hadn't spiked. They hadn't dipped. The kid had delivered the exact volume the engineer usually begged first-timers to aim for. That's good, Hal stammered, pressing the button again. Now give me a bit more. Stevie smiled and then, without warning, launched into a playful riff of notes, jumping octaves, sliding through intervals, shaping each sound with precision that made one of the musicians whistle softly under his breath. The levels stayed perfect. Every note hovered in the sweet spot. Hal's heart pounded. How is he doing that? He whispered to himself. He had never seen anyone, child or adult, instinctively understand a microphone like this blind boy did. Musicians exchanged glances across the studio, the kind of glances that said, "Did you hear that?" The bassist shifted his weight, brow furrowing in disbelief. The drummer, Sticks, resting against his thigh, leaned sideways to get a better look. Even the seasoned sax player, who'd recorded with future legends, stared with his mouth slightly open. They all expected the boy to be talented. Berry Gordy wouldn't have brought him in otherwise, but this was different. This was knowing. Stevie adjusted his distance again, just a half step, barely perceptible, after hearing the faintest feedback bounce off the far wall. Hal didn't need to check the meter to know the correction was perfect. The kid didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't search. He just knew. Hal felt a strange chill glide up his spine. Stevie Wonder hadn't sung a single lyric yet, but he had already done something that left the entire room silently stunned. He'd mastered the microphone before ever using it, and for the first time in his long career, Hal Dixon realized he might be witnessing the birth of someone the world wasn't ready for. Hal cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he was holding his breath. He slid down in his chair just enough to steady himself before pressing the talkback button again. "All right, Stevie," he said, trying to sound composed. "We're gonna run a little warm-up take. Just sing whatever you feel." Stevie nodded once, but before the band could begin, he raised a small hand politely. "Can I hear the room?" he asked. Hal blinked. "Hear the room?" he repeated, confused. Stevie lifted his chin and tilted his head slightly. "Just the empty room. No music yet." Hal hesitated, then cut the monitors. The studio fell silent. No hum from the amps, no shuffle of musicians, just a soft, open quiet. Stevie inhaled deeply, letting the stillness settle into him. He clicked his tongue once, twice, listening to the faint echo bounce back. Then he tapped his foot, soft and precise, feeling the space the way other singers needed to see it. Hal leaned forward, stunned. The boy was mapping the acoustics in his mind. No lessons, no instructions, just instinct. When the room clicked into place in Stevie's brain, he lifted the harmonica hanging from his neck and pressed it gently to his lips. Hal scrambled. He hadn't even armed the track yet, but before he could speak, Stevie released a single note that sliced through the silence like lightning across a black sky. The sound rang warm and clear, bouncing off the wooden floors, sliding along the studio walls, filling every corner without ever overwhelming the mic. Musicians jolted, the drummer's eyes shot wide, the guitarist whispered, "Holy, listen to that." Each note that followed carried a mix of youthful energy and uncanny precision, bending and shaping in ways that felt impossibly mature for an 11-year-old boy who hadn't recorded a single track in his life. Hal's hands flew across the console, adjusting nothing because there was nothing to fix. The kid hit every dynamic level perfectly, not by chance, not by luck, by mastery. After a minute, Stevie lowered the harmonica and waited. Hal stared at him through the glass, momentarily speechless. Then he hit the talkback again. Okay, little man. Let's bring the band in." The musicians straightened, suddenly feeling the pressure of playing behind a prodigy. The drummer twirled his sticks nervously. The bassist wiped his palms on his pants. The pianist cracked his knuckles, muttering, "Ain't no way a kid's getting the best of me tonight." But Hal knew better. He'd seen it in the way Stevie stood, in the way he listened, in the confidence swirling around him like a halo. The band eased into a slow groove, soft and steady, testing levels and finding their rhythm. Stevie adjusted his stance instinctively again, stepping a hair to the left, leaning forward just an inch, and when he opened his mouth to sing his first real line, Hal Dixon gripped the edge of the console because he already knew whatever was about to come next wasn't going to be normal. It was going to be historic. The band eased into a gentle rhythm, drums tapping in a soft shuffle, the upright bass thumping a warm heartbeat, the piano laying down a foundation of mellow chords. But every musician in the room kept one eye on Stevie, waiting, bracing, for the moment the tiny boy would open his mouth. Stevie didn't rush. He inhaled slowly, letting the vibration of each instrument seep into his bones. His foot tapped once, aligning himself with the groove, not visually but by feel, by the way the sound brushed against his skin, by the pulse humming through the floorboards. Hal watched through the glass, his pulse quickening. "Okay, Stevie," he said into the talkback, "whenever you're ready." But Stevie didn't need the cue. He lifted his chin, angled his head slightly away from the mic to soften the initial burst of sound, something only trained vocalists knew to do, and then released his first line. The sound that poured from him wasn't the voice of an 11-year-old child. It was bright, powerful, and textured with a confidence that made every person in the room straighten. His pitch was flawless, floating above the band with a clarity that sent chills up Hal's spine. The musicians exchanged wide-eyed glances, muted shock flashing across their faces. The drummer's sticks froze mid-air. The bassist forgot to blink. Even the pianist, a Motown veteran, leaned back from his keys with his jaw hanging open. Stevie had stepped into the microphone like he'd been born there. He shaped each syllable with precision, adjusting his distance intuitively, stepping closer for soft notes, pulling back for bigger ones. Every breath was controlled. Every slide between notes was intentional. Every sound was placed exactly where it needed to land. Hal's hands hovered above the console, useless for the first time in his career. There were no mistakes to correct, no knobs to tweak, no EQ adjustments to fix. Stevie's natural instinct for mic control was better than most full-grown artists Hal had ever worked with. He leaned toward the glass, whispering under his breath, "My God, he's doing it all on his own." And just when Hal thought the room couldn't be stunned any further, Stevie added a small flourish, a tiny riff at the end of his phrase, playful and improvisational, bouncing in perfect sync with the band. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't coached, it was genius, pure and simple. In the control room, Hal Dixon dropped his pencil onto the console, his mouth falling open. "This kid," he murmured, "he isn't learning the studio, he's commanding it." And in that moment, everyone in Motown Studio A realized the truth. The boy standing behind the microphone wasn't just talented. He was something the world only saw once in a generation, a miracle breathing through music. As Stevie moved into the next line, something extraordinary happened, something no one in the studio had ever witnessed. From a child, let alone an 11-year-old stepping into his very first session, he began playing with the microphone the way seasoned jazz singers played with phrasing. He leaned back an inch to let a high note bloom without peaking the ribbon. He turned his head slightly to the right during a softer run, letting the sound curve naturally into the mic's sweet spot. Every adjustment was microscopic. Half an inch here, a gentle tilt there. But to Hal Dixon, it looked like watching a master sculptor carving sound out of thin air. "He's controlling the room," Hal whispered, stunned. "He's reading the space like Braille." And he was. Stevie could feel the bounce of his own voice returning to him from the studio walls, the warmth of the drums vibrating through the floor, the lift of the piano pushing the air around him. He wasn't reacting to the band was reacting to him. The musicians snapped out of their shock and found themselves leaning into the groove. With renewed intensity, the drummer added a hint of swagger, lifting the song without overpowering it. The bassist slid into a deeper pocket, shaping the rhythm around Stevie's phrasing. The pianist colored the progression with bright accents, unable to hide his grin. "This kid's dangerous," the pianist muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. It wasn't just that Stevie was singing well. It was the fact that he was communicating with the band without saying a word, adjusting his tone, delaying a phrase, adding small breaths that cued the musicians the way veteran performers did after years of touring. And then, as if to prove the point, Stevie lifted his harmonica mid-phrase without missing a beat, tucked the mic slightly to the left, and blew a perfect piercing counter-melody that sent the room into full shock. Hal's hand flew to the console, certain the levels would spike, but they didn't. Stevie's distance was flawless. The harmonica hit. The mic at the precise angle needed to avoid overload. It was a move Hal had only seen done right by the most experienced Motown performers, grown adults who had learned through tough love and dozens of ruined takes. Stevie had never done a take in his life, yet here he was, switching from vocals to harmonica with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. "How?" Hal muttered, leaning forward, his heart pounding. "How does an 11-year-old know how to do that?" Through the glass, Stevie finished the run with a triumphant flourish, pulling back from the mic exactly 2 inches, the perfect fade-out distance, before lowering the harmonica and smiling like he'd just solved a riddle. The band erupted in quiet disbelief, whispering to each other, shaking their heads, and Hal Dixon, a man who believed he had seen everything, sat frozen behind the console with one thought pounding in his chest. This kid wasn't meant to learn the studio. He was born for it. Stevie moved deeper into the take, and the room responded as if it were alive, breathing with him, bending around him, rising and falling with every sound he released. He wasn't performing. He was communing with the space. Each time he inhaled, Hal Dixon could see the ribbon inside the microphone flutter ever so slightly, as if it too were bracing for the next burst of brilliance. When Stevie leaned in for a fuller, chestier note, he instinctively softened his consonants to keep the mic from catching any harsh pops. When he shifted into a lighter head tone, he stepped a thread closer, warming the ribbon just enough to wrap the sound in golden softness. These were not things children did. These were not things beginners did. These were the quiet micro-movements of singers who had lived inside studios for decades. Yet Stevie did them all without thinking, like breathing. Hal felt goosebumps crawl up his arms as he whispered, "This boy's ear is unreal." Halfway through the take, Stevie made a move that pushed the entire room into stunned silence. During a playful vocal riff, he stepped back from the mic at the exact moment the drummer added a brighter hit on the snare, instinctively avoiding the slight sound clash that would have muddied the recording. He didn't stop singing. He simply shifted his placement by less than a foot, and the mix stayed clean. Hal's eyes widened. He hadn't cued Stevie. The drummer hadn't cued Stevie. The boy just felt it, a tiny imbalance in the soundscape, a vibration too subtle for most ears to detect, and he corrected it with the precision of someone who understood the physics of the room. The sax player turned to the pianist, whispering, "He's mixing himself." The pianist nodded slowly. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, voice hushed with disbelief. "He ain't hearing the music, he's inside it." Then came the moment that sent Hal Dixon's heart into his throat. Stevie reached a section where the melody climbed into a bright, ringing phrase. Any other kid, any other artist, would have belted into the mic and risked blowing the levels, but Stevie took one graceful step back, tilted his chin upward, and let the note soar freely across the room instead of straight into the ribbon. The result was breathtaking. The note shimmered, filling the studio with a glowing resonance that the mic caught perfectly. Not harsh, not distorted, but pure. The meters danced in flawless balance. The band froze mid-groove. Hal pressed a hand to his chest. "No," he whispered, barely able to breathe. "No kid does that. No kid knows that." But Stevie didn't seem aware of the magic he was creating. He just smiled, wide, innocent, joyful, like an 11-year-old who was simply having the time of his life. And as the take rolled on, the truth settled over everyone in the room. They were not witnessing a child learning how to record. They were witnessing a child rewriting the rules of what it meant to understand music itself. As the final chorus approached, even the band began holding their breath between measures, unsure of what Stevie would do next, but certain it would be something they'd never seen before. The tiny boy in oversized shoes leaned into the rhythm, feeling the bass vibrate through the floorboards, letting the drums guide the cadence of his breath. Then, as the band softened into the outro, Stevie performed the move that would be talked about in Motown halls for decades. He placed one hand gently on the microphone stand, light as a feather, not enough to make a sound, and slid it an inch to the left. An inch. Hal Dixon shot upright in his chair. Ribbon mics were notoriously sensitive. Even seasoned artists avoided touching the stands unless told. But instead of causing a problem, Stevie's subtle adjustment aligned the microphone perfectly with the resonance of the room, tightening the warmth around his voice just as he began the final line. The result was stunning. His voice landed in the center of the mic's pickup pattern with a fullness so perfect Hal nearly forgot to breathe. The band watched, mesmerized, as Stevie delivered the last phrase with the grace of someone born decades before his time. He ended the line by pulling back from the mic exactly 2 steps, 2 clean, measured steps, creating a natural fade-out more beautiful than anything an engineer could manufacture. The ribbon in the microphone vibrated softly, capturing every ounce of air, every shimmer of tone, every ounce of childlike joy wrapped inside astonishing genius. Then Stevie lowered his head, smiling shyly, as if he hadn't just made history in a dimly lit Detroit studio. The room erupted, not with noise, but with stunned, reverent silence. No one dared speak. No one wanted to break the sacredness of what had just happened. Even the air felt charged, holding the last vibration of Stevie's voice like a secret it didn't want to release. Hal Dixon leaned forward and pressed the talkback button with a shaking finger. His voice cracked. "Stevie, that was perfect." Stevie lifted his head, confused. "Do we do it again?" he asked innocently. Hal let out a breathless laugh, half disbelief, half awe. "If we tried," he said, "I'm not sure we could capture it that perfect again." The musicians nodded silently, some shaking their heads, some wiping their eyes, all knowing they had just stood in the presence of something rare. Stevie stepped away from the mic, running his fingers lightly along the stand, as if thanking it for holding his voice. Hal pushed back from the console, standing slowly, staring through the glass at the tiny boy whose talent defied logic. In all his years, he had never seen an artist understand a studio so naturally, so intuitively, so completely. And as the final resonance of the take settled into the silence, one truth became clear to everyone in the room. Stevie Wonder hadn't entered his first studio session as a child hoping to learn. He entered it as a legend, beginning to reveal himself. When the final note faded from the monitors and silence took hold of Studio A, it wasn't the kind of silence people slipped into casually. It was thick, sacred, like the entire room was holding its breath, knowing it had just witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. Hal Dixon stepped out from behind the console, legs unsteady, and pushed open the door. To the live room, the musicians turned toward him instinctively, as if waiting for permission to react, to speak, to breathe again. But Hal didn't say a word. He just stared at Stevie, this 11-year-old boy with a harmonica hanging from his neck and a shy smile tugging at his lips, as if he were trying to understand how a child could walk into a studio for the first time and handle a ribbon mic with the instinct of a lifelong master. Stevie stood quietly, hands clasped behind him, rocking gently on his heels, as though he had no idea he had just changed everyone in the room. The bassist approached him first, kneeling so he was eye level. "Little man," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "You just did something grown men can't do on their best days." Stevie grinned, shrugging softly, as if the compliment didn't quite make sense. The pianist laid a hand on his shoulder. "You hear music different, don't you?" Stevie tilted his head thoughtfully. "I feel it," he said simply. That one sentence sent chills down Hal's spine. It explained everything: the precise mic adjustments, the flawless harmonica placement, the natural self-mixing, the way Stevie navigated the acoustics like he could see sound itself. He felt it, not just with his ears, but with his whole body, with his soul. And that was something no training could teach, no textbook could explain. It wasn't learned, it was born. Berry Gordy entered the room then, having heard enough from the hallway to know that a moment of history had just taken place. He looked at Hal, eyebrows raised. Hal exhaled slowly, lifting one shaky hand to point at Stevie. "Berry," he said, voice cracking, "this kid, This kid is going to change everything. Stevie turned toward the sound of Hal's voice, his face lighting up. "Did I do it right?" he asked. Hal let out a soft, emotional laugh. "Stevie," he said, "you didn't just do it right, you did it perfect." Musicians nodded. Some clapped, quietly. One backup singer whispered, "Lord, we're looking at the future." And as the fluorescent lights hummed above them and the smell of warm tube amps lingered in the air, the truth settled softly over everyone in the room. The world didn't yet know the name Stevie Wonder, but after tonight, destiny had already begun its work.